The early morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the bridal suite, casting a soft glow on Kimberly's ivory dress as it hung from the vintage mirror. It was the biggest day of her life, and she felt it in the way her heart fluttered and her fingers trembled as her best friend zipped up her gown. Laughter from the hallway echoed in waves, the clinking of glassware, the hurried steps of caterers, and the sweet sound of her younger cousins playing tag in the backyard. For once, everything felt almost magical. Nancy, her mother, stood behind her, brushing a loose curl behind Kimberly's ear. "You look just like I did on my wedding day," Nancy said with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Kimberly turned, searching her mother's face for something deeper, but Nancy was already fussing with the hem of her dress. Downstairs, Edward was orchestrating last-minute details with the precision of a man used to being in control. He shook hands, cracked jokes with guests, and posed for pictures like nothing was out of place. Ronald, their son, kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath about how their father always managed to make everything about himself. But Kimberly wouldn't let tension take root today. She was marrying the love of her life, Jeremy, and she had waited years for this. As her string quartet began rehearsing outside and the scent of white roses filled the venue, she allowed herself a moment of pure bliss. "Mom," she whispered, holding Nancy's hand, "I know things haven't always been perfect in this family, but thank you for holding it all together." Nancy squeezed her hand, her voice soft and heavy with meaning. Some things are worth holding, even when they hurt. Kimberly didn't fully understand what her mother meant. Not yet. But in a few hours, the perfect illusion of her family would begin to unravel, starting with the arrival of someone who should never have been invited. The ceremony was just 30 minutes away when the rustle of luxury heels and the sudden hush of murmurs shifted the atmosphere in the reception area. Edward stepped into the garden courtyard, dressed immaculately in a navy blue tuxedo that shimmered subtly under the afternoon sun. But he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Margaret, a striking woman at least 20 years his junior, wrapped in an emerald green dress that clung to her like a second skin. Her smile was too confident, her eyes scanning the crowd like she belonged. A gasp rippled through the rows of extended family and longtime friends who had known Nancy since her youth. Margaret clutched Edward's arm possessively, brushing an invisible lint off his lapel. "Do you think they know?" she asked under her breath, lips curling into a smirk. Edward gave a short, dismissive chuckle. "It's Kimberly's wedding. Nobody's going to cause a scene." But a scene was already brewing, silently, beneath the surface. Aunt Lillian leaned toward Uncle David and whispered, "That's not Nancy, is it?" Margaret's name bounced around like a pinball from one set of stunned lips to another. The photographer paused, uncertain whether to snap the moment or respect the sudden shift in energy. Edward, oblivious to, or perhaps defiant of, the tension, guided Margaret to the second row, directly behind the bride's family seating. "I want to see Kimberly up close," he murmured. As they settled, Margaret tugged at her neckline and grinned at the floral arch. "Isn't this adorable?" she said, unaware of, or maybe indifferent to, the eyes burning holes into her back. In that moment, Edward had made a choice, not just to bring his mistress, but to parade her at a sacred family milestone. And from that point forward, nothing about the day would feel the same again. Nancy stepped through the entryway with her heels clicking faintly on the cobbled path, her smile poised, her demeanor composed. Her lavender dress floated around her knees as she greeted old college friends and cousins she hadn't seen in years. But when her eyes met Edward's and then shifted to the woman beside him, the warmth drained from her face. Her breath caught just for a second, as if time folded in on itself. Margaret waved with a fluttering hand, as if they were old acquaintances, and Nancy's eyes dropped to the woman's hand, still clutching Edward's arm. "Who is she?" she asked Ronald quietly, not needing the answer. Ronald didn't respond. He just stared ahead, his jaw clenching tight. Nancy gave a short nod, as if confirming something she had always suspected but never had the proof or courage to name. "I thought he'd have the decency to keep it hidden today," she whispered, lips barely moving. "Guess I gave him too much credit." Ronald's voice was low, almost growled. "You don't have to take this, Mom." Nancy's smile returned, faint and ghost-like, as she threaded her arm through his. Not today, it's Kimberly's moment. But as they took their seats, Nancy's eyes flickered between her husband and the woman who had clearly stolen more than just his time. Her heart didn't race, it slowed, like something giving up inside her. She had spent years watching Edward drift, coming home later, offering fewer explanations, smiling only when it served him. But seeing Margaret made it real. There was a face to the absence, and worse still, it was so public, so shameless. Across the aisle, Margaret leaned into Edward and whispered something that made him laugh. Nancy turned away. She wouldn't cry, not here. But her silence spoke volumes, and Ronald, who had seen too much growing up, made a silent vow not to let his mother be humiliated again. Backstage, in the bridal dressing room, Kimberly was oblivious to the chaos rippling outside. She was reapplying her lipstick, her voice light as she rehearsed her vows under her breath. "You are my calm in the storm," she whispered, smiling. But when her maid of honor, Felicia, stepped in with a strange expression, Kimberly paused. What is it?" Felicia hesitated, then said carefully, "Your dad brought someone." Kimberly's brow furrowed. "Someone like who?" Felicia bit her lip. "She's not your mom." That was all it took for Kimberly's fingers to stiffen mid-stroke, her lipstick now bleeding at the edge of her lip. "Tell me exactly what you saw," she said, voice shaking just slightly. "She's sitting with him. Younger woman. Everyone's whispering. Your mom saw her too. She hasn't said a word." Kimberly turned toward the mirror, her eyes scanning her own reflection, her veil, her makeup, her smile. Suddenly it all felt artificial. "He brought her here. Today," she said, not expecting an answer. She sat down slowly, her breath coming in short waves. "He's ruining everything." Felicia knelt beside her. "You don't have to let him," Kimberly laughed bitterly, "but he already has." There was a knock on the door. A coordinator's voice announced, "5 minutes, ladies." Kimberly stood, adjusted her veil, and looked in the mirror again, but now she noticed how much her eyes resembled Nancy's. Tired, observant, and far too used to disappointment. "Felicia," she said quietly, "if my mom holds it together, then so will I. But after this day, I don't ever want to see him the same way again." Outside the doors, her family's fractures were widening. But inside, a bride was learning, too soon, that fairy tales could be rewritten in real time, and sometimes the villain wore your father's face. The reception sparkled with soft lights and champagne bubbles, yet beneath the surface, tension simmered like a forgotten pot on the stove. Edward clinked his glass with practiced grace, rising to deliver the father of the bride toast. "To my beautiful daughter Kimberly," he began, raising his glass high. "May your love last longer than mine has ever deserved." Laughter trickled around the room, though some guests glanced uncertainly at Nancy. She sat at the family table, her expression unreadable, her hand curled gently around her wine-glass. Margaret, seated just behind Edward, laughed too loudly, drawing attention. Kimberly watched from her seat beside Jeremy, her stomach twisting with something far more bitter than nerves. She studied her father's polished smile, the way he gestured like a man untouched by shame. Nancy didn't touch her glass. She stared straight ahead, letting the words pass over her like a cold wind. "You always did know how to put on a performance," she murmured under her breath, barely audible to Ronald, who sat beside her. Edward continued, "And to Nancy, thank you for giving me the greatest gift of all, our children." He raised his glass toward her, and for a moment the room held its breath. Nancy gave a slight nod, but her eyes never reached Edward's. Kimberly couldn't take it anymore. She stood suddenly, cutting through the murmurs. "To my mother," she said clearly, voice strong, "who showed me what love looks like when it's silent, patient, and unappreciated. I see you, Mom." The applause that followed was quiet, awkward, but it reached Nancy's ears. And in that single moment, something inside her cracked and began to shift. It was the first time in decades someone had chosen her in public. The music swelled as the first dance began, Kimberly and Jeremy gliding gently across the wooden floor under the fairy lights. Guests smiled, clapped, and wiped away tears, but Nancy remained seated, staring at the couple with aching pride. As the rhythm shifted and couples were invited to join, Edward approached Nancy and extended his hand. "One dance. For old time's sake," he asked, the words thick with charm and rehearsed softness. Nancy looked up, lips tight. "You already have a dance partner," she replied, nodding toward Margaret, who was sipping champagne and eyeing them curiously. Edward chuckled, lowering his hand. "It's just a dance, Nancy. Don't make this bigger than it is." But it was bigger, much bigger. Nancy rose to her feet without taking his hand and moved toward the garden, where the night air felt easier to breathe. Alone beneath the arbor, her thoughts swirled. She remembered birthdays he forgot, anniversaries dismissed as just a date, and late nights spent pretending the couch was more comfortable than their bed. Years of betrayal hadn't come with grand confrontations. They came quietly, in sighs and silence, and choosing not to ask questions she didn't want honest answers to. "You okay?" Ronald's voice broke her reverie. She looked at him and smiled faintly. "I used to think being a good wife meant swallowing my pain. But maybe I was just afraid of losing a man who never chose me to begin with." Ronald exhaled, his jaw tightening. "You didn't lose him, Mom. He gave himself away." They stood in silence, mother and son, united not by the ceremony, but by the invisible scars it exposed. Nancy didn't say it aloud, but something inside her began to whisper, "It's time." Ronald found himself alone by the fireplace in the side lounge, watching the flames curl and shift as if they carried voices from the past. In the background, the laughter and music of the reception continued, but he was far away, buried in memories. He thought about the nights Nancy stayed up waiting for Edward, the way she never cried in front of them, but always had red eyes in the morning. He remembered when she turned down her job offer from the publishing firm just so Edward could relocate for his promotion. "We needed stability," she had said. But now Ronald saw it for what it was, sacrifice disguised as partnership, silence mistaken for support. He clenched his fists, the resentment in his chest older than he'd realized. "All those years," he whispered, "and he still brought her here." Moments later, Edward strolled in, fixing his cufflinks, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Ron," he said, "what are you doing in here? Come back out. Kimberly's cutting the cake soon." Ronald didn't turn. "Why did you bring her?" Edward sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I didn't want drama. I thought if I kept it low-key." "Low-key," Ronald snapped, finally turning. "You brought your mistress to your own daughter's wedding. You didn't just disrespect Mom, you disrespected all of us." Edward's face hardened. "Margaret is part of my life now. It's complicated." "No, it's not," Ronald said coldly. "You just got used to taking without giving back. And Mom, she gave you everything." Edward looked away, jaw clenched. "You don't understand marriage." "No," Ronald replied, voice softening with pain, "but I understand betrayal. And I understand watching my mother shrink herself just so we could pretend we were whole." He walked past Edward, leaving him standing alone in a room that had suddenly gone cold. And for the first time that evening, Edward began to feel the sting of consequences. The cake had been sliced, the bouquet tossed, and Kimberly should have felt nothing but joy. Instead, she stood on the second-floor balcony of the venue, gripping the railing until her knuckles paled. Below, she saw Margaret twirling playfully in her dress, laughing as Edward whispered something in her ear. Kimberly's new husband, Jeremy, had gone to the car to grab a forgotten gift box, but even his comforting presence couldn't anchor her tonight. Her heart wasn't just bruised, it was unraveling. "He looked at her like she was his whole world," Kimberly whispered, blinking fast, "and I had to pretend I didn't see it." Nancy appeared beside her quietly, arms folded, gaze fixed ahead. "It hurts more when the pain has no apology," she said. "I know that feeling well." Kimberly turned to her mother, her voice cracking. "Why didn't you ever leave him?" The question had lived on her tongue for years, but tonight it finally escaped. Nancy didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath, her eyes tired but resolute. "Because I thought keeping the family together mattered more than my own happiness. Because I was raised to endure, not escape. And maybe I was afraid of what life would look like without him." Kimberly's lips trembled as she absorbed the truth she had always suspected. "I'm so sorry you had to live like that." Nancy finally turned to her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Don't be sorry for me. Just promise me you'll never make the same mistake." Kimberly nodded, tears blurring her vision. At that moment, the wedding felt like an illusion collapsing in slow motion. And though her vows had bound her to Jeremy, it was her mother's quiet survival that would echo the longest. Later that night, in the dim hotel suite far from the lingering music and laughter, Nancy sat on the edge of the bed, unzipping her heels in silence. Edward was already inside, loosening his tie, acting as though the day had passed without incident. "You embarrassed me," she said finally, not looking at him. He froze mid-motion. "Excuse me?" She stood slowly, her tone quiet but firm. "You didn't just bring her to our daughter's wedding. You flaunted her, like I'm just some relic from your past." Edward's face shifted into a familiar mask of indifference. "You're reading too much into this, Nancy. It's not like I introduced her as my mistress." Her laugh was hollow. "You didn't need to. Everyone knew. They always have." Edward turned defensive, arms crossed. "I've tried, Nancy. You stopped being a wife to me a long time ago." Her face twisted in disbelief. "Is that your justification? That I stopped serving you like a maid or nodding like a puppet? I gave you years of loyalty, of silence, of sacrifice." She took a shaky step toward him. "You think I didn't notice the late nights? The different colognes? The perfume that wasn't mine?" His eyes dropped, just for a moment. She inhaled deeply, voice low. "The worst part is I stopped asking. Because I thought asking meant I still believed you could change." He finally looked at her, something softening behind his defenses. "So what now?" he asked. She stared at him, eyes brimming but steady. "Now, I don't know, but I do know one thing." She picked up her overnight bag and slung it over her shoulder. "You don't get to define my worth anymore." And with that, she walked into the bathroom and closed the door, leaving Edward in the stillness of everything he had broken but never acknowledged. The mirror in the hotel bathroom was fogged from the shower, but Nancy saw herself clearly for the first time in years. She wiped the glass slowly, revealing a face that had carried decades of compromise, loneliness, and silence. Her fingers traced the faint lines around her eyes, lines earned not from laughter, but from the exhaustion of staying strong when she was crumbling inside. She stared at her reflection with a strange mixture of grief and awe. "You survived," she whispered to herself, voice trembling. She thought about the young girl she once was, full of promise, ready to conquer the world, believing in forever. That girl would never have imagined she'd spend her prime waiting for someone who barely noticed her anymore. She pulled her robe tighter around her body and sat on the bathroom bench, the silence wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel numb, she felt angry. Not the kind of rage that screamed or shattered things, but the quiet, aching kind that pulsed in the bones. "I gave him everything," she whispered to the tiles. "And he gave me nothing I couldn't have given myself." Her eyes welled up again, but she didn't cry. There was a new fire beneath the pain, one that whispered that it wasn't too late. Maybe she couldn't get those years back, but she could stop handing him her future. She stood, head high, heart heavy, but spirit awakening. The reflection staring back at her wasn't just a wife anymore. It was a woman reclaiming her story, one breath at a time. The morning sun crept into the hotel room through sheer curtains, painting golden streaks across the rumpled sheets. But Nancy wasn't there to see it. She had risen hours before dawn, packing her small carry-on with the quiet precision of a woman who had already made up her mind. Her movements were gentle, deliberate, almost like a ritual. She left her wedding outfit folded on the chair by the window, her wedding ring placed neatly atop it. There were no dramatic tears, no slammed doors, just a silence so complete it echoed. By the time Edward stirred and rolled toward her side of the bed, the space was cold, her scent gone, her absence deafening. He blinked at the empty room, confused at first, until he noticed the missing bag, then the untouched breakfast tray she'd ordered the night before. Downstairs, the concierge handed Edward a small envelope that had been left at the front desk. Inside, a single handwritten note. "I won't be here when you return. But truthfully, I haven't been here in years." Edward sat on the edge of the lobby couch, the note trembling in his fingers. For the first time, her absence wasn't temporary. It was final. The reality weighed down on him slowly, like a sinking ship. He looked around, expecting to see Margaret, hoping perhaps for comfort or reassurance, but she was nowhere in sight. There was only the echo of his choices, reverberating in the hollow pit of his chest. He pressed the note to his lips, and though he didn't realize it yet, this was the beginning of his regret. Back at their family home, Edward walked into the master bedroom, a place that suddenly felt foreign. Nancy's touch lingered in the smallest details, the neatly arranged books, the faint scent of lavender on her pillow, the picture frames turned ever so slightly, just the way she liked them. On the dresser sat a second note, longer this time. Her handwriting was calm, steady. I stayed because I loved the idea of us. I left because that idea became a cage. I want to remember who I was before I disappeared into your shadows. He read it once, then again, and again. Each line unraveled something tightly wound inside him. He sat on the edge of the bed, the frame creaking beneath his weight, and stared at the wall, numb. Edward tried to call her. Her phone rang twice, then straight to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. What could he possibly say? That he missed her. That he didn't mean to humiliate her. That Margaret wasn't serious. None of it would hold. The truth was that Nancy had given him everything, and he had treated her devotion like background noise, present, reliable, and undeserving of thanks. He thought about the time she surprised him at work with lunch, only to wait an hour in the lobby while he finished a meeting. Or how she stayed up for him every time he traveled, never sleeping until she heard the click of the door. He had dismissed her constancy as ordinary, when in truth, it had been the foundation of his life. Now, stripped of it, he felt adrift. No matter how luxurious the house, it felt empty. And for the first time, he wondered if she had truly left him, not in anger, but in strength. Margaret stood in front of the floor-length mirror in her apartment, holding the dress she had worn to the wedding against her body. At first, she'd felt victorious, even proud, walking into that event on Edward's arm, seated at his side like she belonged. But the applause hadn't been for her. The stares hadn't been admiration, they were judgment cloaked in polite silence. She stared at her reflection, seeing the truth for the first time. "You thought you were winning," she whispered to herself. "But he's still hers in all the ways that matter." Margaret wasn't naive. She had always known Edward was still married, still living a double life. But she had believed she was the upgrade, the fresh start. Now, she wasn't so sure. Later that evening, Edward arrived at her apartment. She opened the door to find him drained, his shoulders heavy, his words slow. "Nancy's gone," he said, as if announcing the weather. Margaret stepped aside to let him in, but hesitated before touching him. "Are you okay?" she asked. Edward didn't answer. He walked to the window and stared into the city lights. "I didn't think she'd actually leave." Margaret swallowed hard. "And what now? What does that mean for us?" There was a long silence before Edward finally turned. "I don't know." It was the first honest thing he'd said to her in weeks. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. She had stepped into a story already written, and no matter how close she got, she'd always be a footnote. That night, as Edward fell asleep on her couch, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen counter, the weight of reality pressing in. She had taken another woman's place, but not her worth. The honeymoon suite felt like a stranger's room, decorated in white roses and soft candlelight, yet heavy with tension. Kimberly sat on the edge of the bed, her wedding dress crumpled on the floor, her hair half undone. Jeremy stood by the window, unsure of what to say. "You've barely spoken to me since we left the venue," he said gently. Kimberly looked up, her eyes rimmed red. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's just, I feel like my whole world cracked open tonight." He approached, placing a careful hand on her shoulder. "Do you want to talk about it?" She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I looked at my mother today and realized she's been quietly drowning for decades. And I stood next to the man who pushed her under every single day. And I smiled for pictures." Jeremy sat beside her, taking her hand. "You're not responsible for his choices," he said softly. "But I feel responsible for seeing it and saying nothing," Kimberly replied. "I saw the way he looked at that woman, and I saw the way my mom looked like she was made of glass." The silence passed between them, heavy but tender. Kimberly finally stood, pulled her suitcase out from the closet, and began to unzip it. Jeremy's brow furrowed. "Where are you going?" She turned to him with tearful determination. "Home. I need to find her. before she slips away from all of us completely. Jeremy nodded slowly. Do you want me to come with you? She shook her head. No, this is something I have to do on my own. Hours later, she boarded the earliest flight back to their city, not as a bride, but as a daughter racing toward a woman she feared she might have waited too long to understand. The cottage sat at the edge of a wooded clearing, nestled between the whispering trees and a quiet lake that reflected the pale morning sky. Nancy unlocked the creaky wooden door and stepped inside, a wave of familiar scents embracing her: old books, cedar wood, and solitude. It had once belonged to her mother, a retreat she'd inherited but rarely visited. Now it felt like sanctuary. She placed her small suitcase by the door and walked barefoot to the porch, her heart finally exhaling. The silence was overwhelming, but in a way that comforted rather than unsettled. She brewed tea on the rusted stove and wrapped herself in a shawl, watching as the mist rolled over the lake's surface. There were no voices demanding, no expectations, no pretenses. Just her. She spent the afternoon walking the perimeter of the lake, collecting her thoughts like smooth stones. With each step, memories surfaced, not of Edward, but of herself. Of the girl who once painted in journals and scribbled poetry on napkins. Of the woman who once had dreams that didn't involve picking up someone else's pieces. As the sun began to set, she sat on the dock and dipped her feet into the cool water. I forgot what peace felt like, she murmured to no one in particular. The phone she had turned off buzzed quietly in her bag, but she ignored it. She wasn't ready to let the outside world in, not yet. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without bracing for disappointment. And in that stillness, something sacred stirred within her. Not revenge, not rage, but rediscovery. She wasn't sure who she would become yet, but she knew she was finally stepping out from under the shadow that had followed her for far too long. That evening, as twilight poured into the small cottage, Nancy opened the drawer of her mother's old writing desk. Inside were unused stationery sets, brittle photographs, and, unexpectedly, her own journals left behind years ago. Dust clung to the leather covers as she opened the first one, pages yellowed but words vivid. They were raw, heartbreaking entries, letters she'd written to herself, to Edward, and even to her children, but had never mailed or shared. I miss being someone, one entry read. Not a mother, not a wife, just someone. She clutched the journal to her chest, the weight of her unspoken pain heavier now in her hands than it ever was in her heart. She read for hours, curled beneath a blanket, each word a wound reopened, but also a breath released. Tonight, he didn't come home again. I set the table for two. I don't know why. Nancy wiped a tear from the corner of her eye, not from sorrow, but from the relief of finally confronting it. These pages were her proof, that she hadn't imagined the neglect, that her silence hadn't been peace, that her survival had come at a cost. The journal ended with a blank page. She picked up a pen with trembling fingers and began to write, not to Edward, not to her children, but to herself. You are still here. And that matters more than anything he ever failed to see. The ink bled slightly as the words soaked into the page, each one anchoring her more firmly into the woman she was reclaiming. The past would no longer be her prison. It would be her reason to rise. Rain clattered against the windshield as Edward pulled up to Ronald's apartment building, his suit jacket wrinkled, hair uncombed for the first time in weeks. He sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the dashboard, as if expecting it to offer him a script. He finally forced himself out and knocked on Ronald's door, clutching an umbrella with shaking hands. Ronald opened it after the second knock, eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" he asked flatly. Edward tried to offer a smile. "Just to talk." Ronald didn't move. "You should have thought about talking before humiliating Mom in front of everyone she loves." Edward sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't think she'd actually leave." Ronald's jaw tightened. "That's the problem. You never thought she could." Edward stepped into the entryway, his shoes dripping rainwater. "Ron, I know I made mistakes. I was selfish. But I didn't mean to destroy our family." Ronald crossed his arms. "You didn't just destroy a family, you erased a woman. She disappeared into your shadow, and you let her." Edward looked down, silence swallowing the space between them. "I want to fix it," he said quietly. "Then go find her," Ronald snapped. "Not to win her back, not to plead, but to apologize like a man who finally understands what he lost. Edward met his son's eyes, seeing for the first time how much resentment had lived there. "I never wanted you and Kimberly to hate me," he whispered. Ronald's tone softened, but only slightly. "We don't hate you, Dad. We're just done pretending you were ever the hero in this story." The door closed behind him with a final click, leaving Edward alone in the hallway, soaked in rain and regret. Margaret sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by unopened mail, a wine glass in one hand and her phone in the other. She scrolled through social media posts from the wedding, smiling faces, filtered videos, a blurred photo of Edward in the background, but her name was never mentioned. Her presence had been carefully avoided, like an infection no one wanted to acknowledge. "You're not part of their story," she muttered to herself. "You're just a footnote." When Edward arrived unannounced that evening, she didn't rush to the door. She took her time, applying lip balm and brushing her curls before letting him in. He looked tired, older, like someone who had finally realized the price of his choices. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, not unkindly. Edward sat down on the edge of the couch. "Nancy's gone," he said again, like he was still trying to convince himself it was real. Margaret watched him, unsure whether to offer comfort or space. "Did you think she'd sit in that house forever, waiting for crumbs?" she asked, voice laced with bitterness. He didn't answer. "You told me she didn't understand you, that she'd moved on emotionally. But I saw her face at the wedding, Edward. She wasn't cold, she was broken." He looked up sharply. "Are you saying this is my fault?" Margaret set her wine glass down. "I'm saying you never really left your wife. You just ran away from being accountable." Silence stretched between them. "So what now?" he asked. Margaret stood, crossing her arms. "Now, you figure out if you came here because you care about me, or because you have nowhere else to go." And for the first time, Edward had no quick reply, because deep down, he wasn't sure which was true either. Back at the house, Edward tried again. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped on Nancy's name for the 6th time that day. Ring, ring, voicemail. Her voice was calm, distant. Leave a message, but he didn't. He never did. What could he say that wouldn't sound hollow now? He paced the kitchen, pausing by the window where Nancy used to grow herbs in little clay pots. The basil was dead, the mint brittle and yellow. He hadn't noticed until now. He hadn't noticed a lot of things. The hum of the fridge was the only noise in the house. No footsteps, no soft humming from the bathroom, no gentle creak of the bed when she settled in with a book. It was unbearable. That night, he sat at the edge of the bed, her side, and stared at his phone like it held answers. Margaret hadn't called him back since their last conversation. Kimberly hadn't responded to his texts. Even Ronald had gone silent. He scrolled through old photos on his phone, anniversaries, vacations, blurry selfies Nancy used to take when he wasn't looking. In each one, her eyes looked more distant as the years passed. He hadn't even seen it. He clicked on an old video. Nancy laughing in the garden, teasing him as he held the hose too high. Her joy was real, her presence full. And he had treated it like background noise. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the dark room, but the silence swallowed it whole. He tried one more time, called again. This time it rang out completely. The screen blinked. Call ended. No answer. That was when he realized he wasn't just losing her. He already had. Nancy sat on the porch swing of the cottage, a half-read book resting on her lap, when she heard the soft crunch of gravel under tires. A dusty rental car pulled up slowly. Her heart jumped as Kimberly stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the earth. She looked out of place in her silk blouse and fitted trousers, but her eyes carried a familiar weight, the same one Nancy had seen in the mirror for years. "Mom," Kimberly said quietly, walking toward her. Nancy rose, unsure whether to smile or cry. "You found me," she said, voice thick with emotion. Kimberly embraced her tightly, as if afraid she might disappear. "I had to," she whispered. "You left without saying goodbye." Nancy held her daughter's face in her hands. "I didn't want you to carry the weight of my choices." Inside the cozy living room, Kimberly sat across from her, hands clasped in her lap. "I've been thinking about you constantly," she said. "About everything you've been through. About what I didn't see." Nancy offered a gentle smile. "You saw what you needed to. I hid the rest." Kimberly's voice cracked. You were never just my mother. You were a woman, too. And I never asked how you were doing. Nancy exhaled slowly. You didn't need to. You were my focus. But now, I want to find out who I am when I'm not tending to everyone else. Kimberly reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is from the wedding photographer, she said. You looked so beautiful that day, even with everything happening. Nancy opened the envelope and pulled out a photo, her face calm, distant, standing just behind Kimberly. I look like I was saying goodbye, Nancy murmured. Kimberly nodded. Maybe you were. But I think you're also finally saying hello to yourself. That night, after Kimberly had gone to bed in the spare room, Nancy sat by candlelight with her journal open, the pages blank but heavy with intention. She took a slow sip of tea and began to write, not a letter to Edward this time, but a declaration. I gave 30 years of my life to a man who only saw me when he needed something. I will not spend another minute asking why. Her hand didn't shake. Her breath didn't hitch. This wasn't an act of grief, it was an act of release. She wrote for hours, pouring out pieces of herself that had been silenced. She chronicled her dreams, her longings, her regrets, and her rediscoveries. With every word, the shame unraveled, replaced by a clarity she never expected. The following morning, Kimberly found the journal open on the table, her mother out back tending to a garden bed that hadn't seen flowers in years. You're planting? She asked, stepping outside. Nancy looked up, her hands in soil. For the first time, yes. Kimberly smiled, kneeling beside her. What made you want to start now? Nancy gently placed a small bud into the earth. Because I realized I've been burying myself for years. It's time to grow instead. They sat in comfortable silence, hands brushing against cool dirt. What will you do next? Kimberly asked softly. Nancy looked out over the water, a slow smile forming. Live, on purpose, and not out of obligation. In that moment, the chapter of Nancy's former life was no longer just closed. It had been rewritten. And for the first time in decades, she didn't feel lost. She felt powerful. Ronald sat alone at the dining table, the room dim with late afternoon shadows. Kimberly had sent him a message that simply read, "She's okay. She's different, but okay." He stared at the screen for several minutes before replying. He didn't ask where Nancy was. He didn't need to. All that mattered was that she was safe, and perhaps finally at peace. Across the room, Edward stood near the window, arms folded, eyes distant. "Have you heard from your mother?" he asked. Ronald didn't look up. "She doesn't owe you her voice, Dad." The words weren't cruel, just firm. Edward turned away from the window, sinking into a nearby chair. "I didn't realize how far gone things were." Ronald scoffed. "You didn't see anything, and that was always the problem." Edward leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Do you think there's any chance she'll come back?" Ronald finally met his eyes. "Would you, if you were her?" The question hung in the air. Edward had no answer. He reached for his phone again, fingers hovering over Nancy's name, but he didn't press call. "She's not doing this to hurt you," Ronald added, softer now. "She's doing it to find herself. She gave you her youth, her loyalty, her silence. And all you gave her was absence." Edward bowed his head. "I didn't mean for it to be this way." Ronald stood, walking toward the door. "Nobody means to drown someone. But that doesn't change the fact that she's finally learning how to breathe." As he left the room, Edward remained still, no longer a man in control, but one finally learning what it meant to be alone. The gravel crunched beneath Edward's shoes as he approached the cottage Nancy now called home. The trees whispered with the wind, and the lake nearby shimmered with the fading afternoon sun. He hesitated at the porch, the wooden steps groaning under his weight as he raised his hand to knock. When the door opened, Nancy stood there in soft linen and bare feet, her expression unreadable. "Edward," she said calmly, "I didn't expect you." He swallowed hard. "I needed to see you. I've made so many mistakes, and I don't even know where to begin." She didn't invite him in. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, folding her arms as he fumbled for words. "I was selfish. I treated your devotion like furniture, always there, always silent. I see it now. Too late, maybe, but I see it." Nancy nodded, her gaze distant but firm. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. "I was for a long time, but now I'm just done shrinking to fit into the corners of your life." Edward's shoulders dropped. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to say it to tell you that I know how badly I failed you." She looked at him for a long moment, her silence laced with an ache that no apology could touch. "You didn't fail me, Edward," she said finally. "You failed yourself. You had a woman willing to walk beside you through every season, and you chose to look past her." He took a step closer. "Is there any part of you that still loves me?" Her lips parted, then pressed closed again. "I think I'll always love the version of you I hoped you'd be." The wind rustled the trees as she stepped back toward the door. But that man never showed up. She didn't slam the door as she went inside. She simply closed it with grace, with peace, and with finality. The days that followed were quiet for Nancy, but not the hollow kind. Her silence was deliberate, healing. She joined a book club in the nearby town where no one knew her as Edward's wife or Kimberly's mother. They just knew her as Nancy, the woman who loved historical fiction, warm tea, and walking barefoot through the farmer's market. She didn't offer details about her past unless asked, and even then, she chose what to share. Each time she introduced herself, she felt a sliver of pride. It was strange, rebuilding from nothing, but it was also freeing. She began leaving sticky notes around her cottage with gentle affirmations. "You are enough. You're allowed to begin again. You are not invisible." They weren't for anyone else. They were for the girl she used to be, the one she was finally learning to care for. One Tuesday afternoon, after finishing a chapter in her novel, she stood at the mirror in the hallway and looked at herself without flinching. Her wrinkles didn't feel like loss anymore. They felt like proof. Her hands, once used to iron Edward's shirts and pack school lunches, were now planting herbs again and turning pages just for pleasure. That evening, she hosted two of her new friends from the club. They drank wine and laughed until their cheeks hurt, playing card games on the living room floor. "You're glowing," one of them said. Nancy blushed, brushing it off. But later, when she stood alone in her kitchen, washing the glasses, she paused. The reflection in the dark window showed a woman she didn't recognize, but admired. A woman who no longer lived in someone else's narrative. She whispered to herself, "I like you." It was the first time she had ever said those words out loud, and meant every syllable. Back at the family home, Edward stood in the doorway of their bedroom, now just his. The scent of lavender had long faded, replaced by something sterile and unfamiliar. Her books were gone, her scarves. Her side of the bed was untouched, the pillow slightly flattened from the last night she slept there. The silence in the room no longer offered peace, it screamed. He wandered the halls with no purpose. The once busy kitchen counter was bare. Her notes, her gentle reminders, her grocery lists, all gone. He sat at the dining table and stared at his plate, only to realize he hadn't eaten all day. He didn't know how to cook her favorite stew. He didn't know where she kept the spare batteries. And for the first time in years, he realized just how much of his life had depended on her quiet, invisible labor. Later that night, he found himself flipping through photo albums, the ones Nancy had organized meticulously, labeling birthdays, anniversaries, family trips. There she was in every photo, behind the camera, beside the children, beaming from a picnic blanket. She had been the glue, the rhythm, the pulse of the home, and he had treated her like wallpaper. He buried his face in his hands. Margaret had stopped calling. Kimberly was distant. Ronald barely replied to his texts. The house, once vibrant with laughter and life, now felt like a museum of his own neglect. He stood in the middle of the living room and whispered, "I didn't know what I had." But no one was there to answer. The walls didn't echo. They only listened. And for the first time, truly, Edward felt what Nancy had felt for years, alone, unseen, and unfinished. A week after settling into their new apartment in Leon, Kimberly sat by the window overlooking the cobblestone street below. Jeremy was out interviewing for a teaching fellowship, but her thoughts weren't on the view or the charming bakery across the street. They were with her mother. With soft music playing in the background, Kimberly unfolded a thick sheet of stationery and began to write. "Mom, I think of you every morning. Every cup of coffee I pour, every walk I take, it's like I'm walking with a new version of you. Not the woman I grew up idolizing, but the one I'm finally getting to know." Her handwriting wavered slightly as she continued. "I used to think strength was quiet endurance, But now I know it's choosing yourself, even when the world expects you to stay small. She ended the letter with a soft confession. You're my role model now, not because you endured, but because you stopped. Sealing it with care, she walked down to the nearest postbox and slid the envelope in, her heart pounding with something between pride and longing. Days later, Nancy opened the letter on her porch swing, sunlight painting gold across the ink. Her hand went to her chest as she read Kimberly's words, tears collecting at the corners of her eyes. She had wondered, worried, even, that her absence would leave wounds. But instead it had created space. Space for understanding. Space for truth. Later that evening, Nancy wrote a reply. You are allowed to evolve without apology, Kimberly. And you are not broken because you feel deeply. You're whole because you honor that feeling. They were two women, once bound by unspoken roles, now connected by shared clarity, mother and daughter, both healing in their own ways. Nancy didn't expect anyone to remember her birthday. She had grown used to that day passing like any other, folding laundry, sipping tea, maybe flipping through an old photo album alone. But this year was different. That morning, she woke to the smell of cinnamon and apples. Ronald stood in the kitchen of her cottage, wearing an apron far too small and holding a slightly uneven apple pie. Happy birthday, Mom, he said with a shy grin. She blinked in disbelief. You remembered. He set the pie down and hugged her tightly. I didn't just remember, I planned this. He gestured to a picnic basket beside the door. We're going to the lake, just you and me. They spent the day sprawled on a blanket by the water's edge, feet dipped in the cool ripples, plates littered with crumbs and laughter spilling freely. Ronald handed her a small wrapped box. Inside was a silver pendant with the word enough etched into it. Nancy's hand trembled as she traced the letters. You are, Ronald said. You always have been. She hugged him close, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years, being seen, not for what she gave, but for who she was. That evening, they lit sparklers on the dock, their reflections flickering across the dark surface of the lake. Nancy looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, not just to Ronald, but to the universe, for allowing her to reclaim joy in the quietest, most unexpected way. It wasn't the grand celebrations that mattered. It was the love that showed up softly, without permission, and stayed." The sanctuary was empty save for the fading afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows. Edward walked slowly down the aisle, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. He paused at the second pew, the one he and Nancy had shared during Kimberly's wedding. Sitting down, he placed his hands on the back of the seat in front of him and stared at the altar. "This is where it all fell apart," he whispered. But deep down, he knew the unraveling had started long before that day. His mind drifted back to their early years. Nancy humming in the kitchen, Kimberly dancing in the hallway, Ronald building forts out of couch cushions. It had all slipped through his fingers while he chased distractions, mistaking them for happiness. He took out his phone, scrolling through old photos, Nancy laughing in a red coat, Kimberly in her graduation gown, Ronald holding a fishing rod twice his height. He hadn't just lost his wife, he had lost the woman who made all those moments feel alive. And now, even the memories felt dim, as if they were trying to erase themselves to protect him from what he didn't want to admit. "I wasn't there," he murmured. "I was always looking past the people right in front of me." He bowed his head, a prayer forming not from religion, but from regret. "I wish I'd been better. I wish I had chosen you. Every time." The church offered no reply, just the gentle creak of old wood and the distant hum of wind against glass. But Edward stayed, hoping that somewhere in the silence, the forgiveness he never earned might still find him. The morning air buzzed with anticipation as Nancy stepped into the modest art gallery nestled in the heart of the town square. She wore a flowing indigo blouse and cream trousers, her short curls pinned softly to one side. Her palms were damp not from fear, but from wonder. After years of hiding in plain sight, she had been invited to co-curate a local exhibit on women's storytelling through visual art. Her journals, once buried in drawers, had become her muse, short quotes from them now framed beside the artwork. As guests trickled in, she watched them pause, read her words, and linger. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Another whispered, This feels like my life. Nancy stood in the corner, overwhelmed, not by crowds, but by connection. A local journalist approached her, microphone in hand. "Ms. Lawrence, how did this collection come to life?" Nancy smiled, thoughtful. "It came from silence," she said. "From all the things women carry but are never asked about. And one day I decided I wanted to be heard." After the short interview, she wandered the gallery, watching her past unfold in paint and prose. Her favorite piece, a sculpture of a woman unclasping chains from her own wrists, sat in the center of the room. Beside it was her quote, "Freedom didn't come from walking away. It came from finally turning toward myself." That night, after the gallery had emptied, she sat in the quiet space, breathing in the echoes of her own reclamation. She didn't miss who she had been. She was grateful for who she had become. Edward sat in his car across the street, engine off, watching through the glass windows of the gallery. He hadn't been invited. He didn't expect to be. But when he saw the article in the local paper with Nancy's name beneath a bold headline, "She found her voice in the silence," he felt compelled to come. Inside, he saw her standing by a sculpture, surrounded by people who leaned into her words, clung to her laughter, celebrated her strength. She glowed in a way he had never noticed before, not because she'd changed, but because he had never taken the time to truly see her. He clutched the steering wheel, heart heavy. This wasn't the woman he had married, this was the woman he had never deserved. As the crowd began to thin, he lowered his head and retrieved a photo from his coat pocket. It was an old picture, Nancy sitting on the beach, smiling, wind tossing her curls. He ran a thumb across the image, whispering, "You made it." A soft knock on the car window startled him. He turned, expecting her, but it was Kimberly, her face unreadable. "She's not looking for closure, Dad," she said gently. "She already found it." Edward nodded slowly. "I know." Kimberly hesitated. "She asked me to give you this." She handed him a sealed envelope and walked away. Inside was a single line, handwritten in elegant script. "Some things bloom only after the storm." No signature, no invitation, just a truth she wanted him to carry. He looked up one last time at the gallery lights, then drove off into the night, not with peace, but with understanding. And sometimes that's all the ending one deserves. Here's the Bible verse. "She clothed herself in quiet strength, and when the time came, she rose without noise, leaving the weight behind her. For the Lord restores the soul of the forgotten and breathes life into the weary heart." Inspired by Psalm 23, verse 3, and Proverbs 31, verse 25, moral of the story, never confuse silence for weakness, nor endurance for acceptance. A woman who has sacrificed herself for the sake of family may one day awaken to her worth, and when she does, her quiet departure will speak louder than any confrontation. True love honors, sees, and protects. But when it fails to do so, self-love becomes not a luxury, but a necessary rebirth. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much for watching.